now in order to consider amendment number 2 printed in House Report 112-283. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 112-283, offered by Mrs. McCarthy of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 463, the gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. McCarthy, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would also like to thank my colleague from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, for working with me on this issue. I rise totally in opposition to H.R. 822. It saddens me, but it does not surprise me that we're here having this debate today. H.R. 822 is unnecessary and seriously flawed piece of legislation. This bill overrides the decisions and forces them to recognize concealed carry gun permits from every other state. Almost every state currently allows carry permits, but states differ substantially in regards to the permitting requirements. They have different minimum age requirements. Some states require safety training before receiving a permit, and some states bar people convicted of certain crimes. These different requirements have been put in place by the elected legislators of the states, who did so with an understanding of the specific needs of their communities. H.R. 822 erases all of that and creates an unworkable system. Under this bill, states with strong gun safety laws, such as New York, California, Massachusetts, would allow out-of-state visitors, potentially as young as 18, to walk down our streets armed and dangerous. There are states in our nation that don't require a background check before issuing a concealed carry permit. There are states in our nation that don't require any firearm training before letting people walk around with a concealed weapon. These are decisions that those states made for themselves. I don't want those decisions imposed upon the communities I represent, and neither should anybody else. Also, police officers would be faced with the task of attempting to determine the authority of permits from 48 other states on the fly, and certainly in tense situations. Simply put, this bill is anti-community, anti-safety, and anti-police. And finally, the bill attempts to solve a problem that simply does not exist. Many states have chosen to enter into these agreements with other states to honor each other's concealed carry permits. Nothing is stopping a state from recognizing a permit from any other state. The fact that states have not done so represents a deliberate choice to only enter into agreements with states that they feel have the proper approach to issuing concealed carry permits. The federal government should not be second-guessing the decision of the states in this matter. It saddens me, but does not surprise me. We are here today discussing not how to make Americans safer and reduce gun violence, but instead we are talking about how to weaken our gun laws and considering a bill that takes local decisions out of the hands of the local officials. The gun manufacturing lobby will try to say otherwise, but I fully support the Constitution, as my colleague had mentioned before. I believe in the rights affordable to the Second Amendment, and I support law-abiding gun owners. It's the absence of a perfect nonviolent society, however, we must make laws to protect the public. I know this firsthand. After all, it was with a man with a concealed handgun that took the life of my husband and gravely wounded my son on the Long Island Railroad back in 1993. Now you may hear arguments today about interstate commerce as a justification for this bill, but this bill has nothing to do with interstate commerce. This bill is simply about the federal government overriding a state's laws about who can carry a concealed weapon. You may also hear comparisons to state-issued driver's license, again, which is recognized nationwide. But if we want to compare guns to cars, as the gun lobby often likes to do, let's have this conversation. Cars use are among the most heavily regulated consumer products and activities in the United States due to the safety risk they pose. One thing that does surprise me, though, is why so many of the supporters of this bill, who have been so vocal about defending state rights in the past, are now choosing, in this instance, to trample on state rights. Federalism dictates that some things should remain in the states and some things should be addressed at the national level. And going back to the matter of interstate commerce, I'm sure all Americans would love to see the House address interstate commerce in a more direct way, which is getting Americans back to work and growing the economy. We should be talking about how to create jobs and prepare the next generation to succeed in a global economy. Instead, we're talking about how to trample on states' rights, weaken gun laws, and make America less safe, all to please our country's powerful gun lobby. So I said, it saddens me, but it does not surprise me that we're having this debate today. I have an amendment under which states would be required to proactively opt in to the agreements called for by H.R. 822. The intent of this amendment is to require that states affirmatively pass legislation enacting the provisions of H.R. 822 before the bill can go into effect in that state. This would restore state rights, something I believe in, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and oppose H.R. 822.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment frustrates the basic purpose of H.R. 822. It requires that states pass legislation to implement the bill's provisions. The Supreme Court, in 2 recent cases, has recognized a fundamental individual right to bear arms that is largely based on the right to defend oneself and one's family. Over 80% of violent crime occurs outside of one's home, according to the Department of Justice. This means that for the right to bear arms in self-defense to have any meaning, law-abiding citizens with permits should be able to carry firearms outside of their homes and sometimes across state boundaries. Under current law, 40 states have established a patchwork of reciprocal agreements that can be confusing for concealed carry permit holders to navigate. H.R. 822 provides uniformity to our concealed carry laws by creating nationwide reciprocity for concealed carry permit holders. By contrast, this amendment allows states to opt out of H.R. 822's federal grant of reciprocity, and it provides that only states that choose to pass laws implementing the legislation must recognize out-of-state concealed carry permits. This amendment would, in effect, just continue the status quo, and so would be of no help to individuals with concealed carry permits. Since 2004, police officers have enjoyed the right to use a concealed carry permit to take a firearm across state lines. And I'd like to complete my statement, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman controls time.
Since 2004, police officers have enjoyed the right to use a concealed carry permit to take a firearm across state lines. And in 2010, President Obama signed legislation to include other law enforcement personnel who could take advantage of this ability. It is ironic that some of these groups now want to deny the same right to law-abiding citizens with concealed carry permits. According to a 2009 Zogby poll, 83% of those polled said they supported concealed carry laws, 83%. Over 4 million Americans across the country have qualified for concealed carry permit. They most likely endorse this legislation. I appreciate the gentlewoman from New York mentioning states' prerogatives, and I hope she will express the same sentiments about other pieces of legislation. H.R. 822 retains the state's ability to regulate firearms in their own states by making clear that all state regulations regarding how a firearm is carried continue to apply to both residents and non-residents, and by keeping in place the state's own permitting process. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this amendment, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman, yield back the balance of his time. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
And I'd like a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on this amendment offered by the gentleman from New York will be postponed.